The Roman Republic has been a huge influence throughout the last two millennia of political thought. Thinkers like Machiavelli, Rousseau, Montesquieu look to it as something of an ideal. The American founders referenced it frequently when setting up their republic. We see its influence in things like the Senate being called the Senate. But how close was this to the real historic system of power under which Rome first emerged and gained its empire? To discuss this with me today, I have a professor of ancient history and, to my mind, one of the best public communicators of ancient history, Bret Devereaux. Bret, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, to start with, can we just go with the name, Res Publica, or Republic as we call it? We think about that as like a specific type of constitutional design, but to the Romans, the name meant something a bit broader, right?
Yeah, so res publica,
I may be
literally
saying
just
it wrong, but yeah.
whatever. There are no Romans left to correct your pronunciation. So res publica, it literally it just means the public thing. Res, res, in Latin is the word it is their equivalent of the word thing with all of the generalities that that implies. It can mean physical matter, it can mean your property, it can mean the matter under discussion. It is this sort of broad, sweeping thing of a word that is very general, and then you just stick publica on it, public. It is the public thing. It is the things held in common. Um, a very literal translation into English of republic would simply be commonwealth. Um, and so for the Romans, what is the republic is always kind of hilariously undefined. We treat this as the republic as a system of government and a political system, and for the Romans, it's both narrower and broader at the same time. And one of the reasons that the republic is able to fall apart and then be reconstructed as a monarchy under Augustus, the first emperor, is that the republic meant different things to different people. And so it was possible to dismantle most of its political institutions and still have a republic in a sense for certain stakeholders for the part of the republic they cared about. So it's a very sort of a very kind of broad term and I think helpfully nebulous. And a reminder that, as we'll see, the republic means different things to different people. And also, this is not a society with a written constitution.
Hmm. I was going to
This
say,
is not a society that sat down and planned out its government. The republic emerges out of traditional institutions, rampant ad hocery, some of which is papered over a little bit in our sources because they retroject the mature republic of the third and second century backwards. Um, but when we actually look at those, like our sources, for instance, will call Rome's chief magistrates consuls from sort of the first day they appear. We know they weren't. We know that the original chief magistrate was a praetor. We know that there was a period where we had military tribunes with consular powers as chief magistrates. They couldn't decide on the number for a long time. Um, that this sort of it's very ad hoc. It's quite nebulous. It runs on custom and tradition rather than written laws. And so most of the rules of the Republic are sort of gentlemen's agreements about what is and isn't done. Um, these eventually get written down. It turns out that writing them down doesn't do much. Um, if the norm is broken, writing it won't save you.
yeah.
Um, and and so the sort of the res publica, the public thing, is I think helpfully nebulous to understand that the republic was the label the Romans put on all of their public affairs, thought about collectively, all of the things that they held in common. There was the res publica, and then there would be rei privata, private matters, and that was the sort of two spheres. And so anything that wasn't a private matter was a public matter. Uh, and this sort of thing. Of course, the other term that the Romans have for the republic is they'll refer to it when it needs a nice formal name is this senatus populusque Romanas, the Senate and people of
You
Rome.
are right.
Yeah, with that SPQR. And I think this is also really instructive. Um, because it speaks to the idea of the Republic as a balancing act, as a creature that is balancing two interests that the Romans see as both legitimate and distinct. There is the Roman people, the sort of everybody, by which it's understood the common people, although technically the elite are still a member of the populace, the people writ large. And then there is the Senate, representing the elite. And the Romans view the Republic in its fundamental nature, they're expressing it as a cooperation between the populace, the people, who have their source of legitimacy and political power, and the Senate, which has an independent source of legitimacy and political power. And this, I find when teaching this, this kind of breaks students' heads somewhat, that the Roman Senate is not like a representative institution, and it's not supposed to be. Um, Now, to be a senator, you usually have to get elected to an office. The Senate is composed of men that have held high office. That's how you get into the Senate. But they don't feel under any obligation to represent the people. They are supposed to be concerned about the state. They're supposed to be good patriots, but they are not representatives of the popular will. Indeed, they are a countervailing force to the popular will. The Senate has its own inherent source of legitimacy. The Romans actually have a term for this, the auctoritas senatus, the authority of the Senate, that um, is seen as separate to and equal with, like co-equal with, the democratic popular legitimacy that rises up from the will of the people. And that's sort of really striking and a way in which the Roman Republic is, I think, very different from our conception of a modern republic. That the Romans think of the elite, the aristocracy, as a, if you want to think about it, a distinct interest group, co-equal with the people, whose interests must be balanced with it.
Differently theorized, but I think there's a fair case to be made that is functionally what modern representative democracies do, but we think about the countervailing force to popular will as something like technocratic expertise, or perhaps
Mm,
on a good day, individual rights, not as you say, this distinct source of legitimacy in its own right.
right.
What was then the, we'll get to the Senate, what was the popular inputs in this system? To what extent were there actual democratic inputs, or was it merely a nice idea that there were these two sources of legitimacy?
Yeah, so I would just want to note on the top, to the degree to which the Republic can be understood as democratic in character has been the core debate about the Republic for the past 40 odd years. Um, really beginning with some of Fergus Miller's arguments where he argued. So through most of the 1900s, the view was that the Republic's democratic elements were just a fig leaf. They weren't real. Fergus Miller came back and says, no, this is actually a democratic form of government. Um, and then that has kicked off 40 years of back and forth arguments that I think are beginning to settle somewhere in the middle. Um, so the core popular inputs are the assemblies. Um, the Romans never want to do anything by half, have not one, not two, but four popular voting assemblies. These are different ways of organizing basically the same voters, and they do different things. But these are all assemblies of essentially all adult citizen Roman males. Um, the most important of these is the Comitia Centuriata, the Centuriate Assembly. Um, it um, elects the highest magistrates. So those guys are elected. These are the consuls and the praetors. Anyone who can command an army must be elected by the Comitia Centuriata. Um, it declares war. It makes peace. And it's used for a few other ceremonial things. It's a very cumbersome assembly, so the Romans don't use it for regular legislation. Um, there are a couple of things to know about it, though, that kind of limit its democratic character. For one, as compared to, say, Athens, Roman assemblies do not deliberate. They are presented something by a magistrate who convenes them, whether that's who should be consul next, have a vote, or should this law pass, and they get up or down, this guy or that guy. They can't alter. the terms of the deal. They can't amend the legislation. They can't debate. They just yes or no. Though I will note that there was a required period before laws would be passed. You had to post them up in the forum for several weeks before you could have a vote, which would provide the opportunity, it was thought, for public debate. The assembly itself does not debate, it does not amend, it cannot propose its own stuff. No matter how much the assembly wants something, if nobody in high office is willing to put it in front of them, it can't happen. Um, the other thing about the Committee of Centuriata, the sort of most senior of these assemblies, is that it is well stratified. It is openly and aggressively well stratified. The Committee of Centuriata is kind of organized. You can think of it similar to the Electoral College in the United States, in that it's a series of voting units, and winning means winning a majority of the units, not winning a majority of the votes. But what the Romans have very deliberately done is they have put different numbers of people in the units by design, openly. It's not an accident of the system. They intended it that way. Um, the units are stratified by wealth, and they're split into the ways you would serve in the army. So there are centuries of cavalrymen, centuries of infantry. There's a couple of centuries of like craftsmen and trumpeters and stuff. And then there's one big century at the bottom for everybody is too poor to afford weapons to fight. Um, and these centuries are differently sized. You can actually do some math on the size of the Roman body and figure that there's the top centuries, the 18 centuries of the Equites probably do have about 100 people in each. Those are the only ones that, right, century is a group of 100. Those are the only ones that are actually groups of 100. Even the upper levels of the infantry centuries need to have a few thousand people for the math to work. By the time you're at the bottom levels of those infantry centuries, probably like 6, 7,000. We don't have exact numbers. I want to be clear. These are like spitball estimates. And that bottom singular century, the capiti censi, those literally counted only by their heads because the only wealth they have to report in the census is themselves. Um, that has to have like 100,000 people in it, by the late Republic, and they all get one vote, right? So 100 equites and the 100,000 poorest Romans have the same voting power in this system.
So to
Um,
to ask a clarifying question, if I were to string out all men in Roman society along a sort of
yeah.
well spectrum, at the bottom you've got presumably enslaved persons and the people too poor to provide weapons. Right at the other end, you've got senators, equites.
Mhm.
In the middle, does the sort of heavy infantry class, as it were, does that go out far enough that like the median person is someone who would own weapons and be drafted and have some political weight?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
The yeah.
we're talking most adult men in this society are citizens, are liable for drafted and expected to be drafted, and have some, albeit weighted, political voice.
Yes. Yeah. Um,
So that's
so
still pretty broad by ancient standards.
that is pretty broad by ancient standards. Yeah. Now by the time you're getting to the sort of the median Roman, you're getting pretty deep into those centuries of infantry. So there is some pretty heavy diluting of voting power. The infantry centuries are heavily weighted towards the first class, which are the probably the wealthiest quarter or so of Roman society, but not overwhelmingly so. And the Roman, like, there's an irony here, and I know we'll come back to this. There's an irony here that the Roman desire to put as many men in the field as possible and the clear belief that the structure of this voting assembly and the structure of the army must match
Hmm.
means that when they reach deep into the society for manpower, they have to extend political participation with it. And so every time they're lowering the requirement to serve to get more guys in the field, they're essentially lowering the thresholds on those bottom centuries that matter as opposed to the century of the extremely poor, which mostly doesn't matter.
But
Um,
but that's interesting, and maybe we could just go straight to that. Is essentially the mechanism for because as you said, this is something that evolved over time. We have some nice stories about lawgivers and so on, but this is something
Right,
that was cobbled together, as you say.
right.
But the mechanism for enfranchisement, or even like partial and weighted enfranchisement, was recruitment, was that we want to have bigger armies. That was how more and more people got brought in.
Yeah, and you can see this through what shows up in our sources is the struggle of the orders. And I was sort of immediate caveat here. We mostly know about the struggle of the orders through Livy, a bit of Dionysius. These are later historians writing fairly great remove. And so a lot of this sort of narrative, we have a lot of doubts. Let me put it this way. But what our sources present is the idea the Republic is formed in 509. It is formed by a conspiracy of the elite senatorial families who will become the patricians. They already are the patricians. And initially, it is a government by, for, and of the patricians. And over the next several centuries, that produces friction between both the great mass of poor non-patrician Romans, and the term for non-patricians is plebeians, and then the smaller slice of wealthy, influential plebeians that emerges, right? This sort of your nouveau riche, which they are a political factor in the Republic almost immediately. That there are men of wealth and consequence outside of the patrician elite who are pushing for greater involvement in the system. And what we get is a series over about 2 centuries of repeated compromises. Um, and what's striking, going back to the sort of the military element, is that the repeated weapon that the plebeians use to get their way is they will wait until the Senate would really like to have an army. And then they're like, well, this you said this was your republic. So why don't you go fight the Samnites or whatever? You get what's called a secessio plebis. The plebs will leave Rome, set up on one of the hills outside of the city, and be like, well, if this is your republic, you run it. Um, and if you want us to do something, then we expect compromise. And they are careful to like pick times where the Senate needs to enroll an army. And so this sort of this pressing demand, because Roman aristocrats want military glory so very, very much, this pressing demand that like consul so and so needs an army. And they're like, yeah, that's when we can put the screws on him and demand our own magistrates, demand more democratic voting assemblies, demand the ability to make laws that are binding on others, demand a written code of laws that binds magistrates, and so on and so forth. I didn't put those concessions in the right order, but those are the things that they push for.
But this is interesting, though, because on the one hand, if you do a sort of rational self-interest view, it is in elites' interest to sort of make these concessions if that means they can field bigger armies and through bigger armies have more power, control more land, go get more loot, right? At the same time, this is usually not how elites behave. Like,
Right.
but like if you look at Rome's peers, like you can run the numbers much better than I, but my understanding is Rome is turning out a much higher percentage of its population in
Oh,
armed
yes.
infantry. And then if you want a really extreme case, you could go to like medieval England or something, which both the Roman Italy and medieval England, I'm not talking like Tudors, like medieval,
Mm,
are like 3, 4 million people. And you've got out of that like 1,000 knights and then maybe like a few thousand armored men, and that is it. Like,
right.
neither side at the Battle of Hastings can top 10K.
Whereas the peak Roman deployments in the Second Punic War is 185,000 men.
So you've got to figure people make these weird historical counterexamples, but like just to be silly, you've got to figure the Roman Republic steamrolls either side of the Battle of Hastings.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and it's like not even particularly close.
It's not close. And if for some reason they don't win, they're going to have another army there the next season.
And then
maybe
another
even the
one,
same
and
season,
another one, and another one.
another one and another one. Yeah. And this
But,
is
but, but
this
what,
is
why are Roman elites making that bargain, whereas other elites seemingly are not as interested or not even remotely interested in it, even if you'd figure it would make them stronger in the long run? Is it just like a different type of social structure they're drawing from?
yeah, and a different set of incentives. Because I do think, I mean, even we've talked about the struggle of the orders. Even when you look at Rome's relationship with other communities in Italy, you can predict what the Romans will do by just asking what maximizes military power, manpower, heavily armored troops in this circumstance, and the Romans will do it almost every time. And it's remarkable because it often requires elites to sacrifice short-term financial interests for long-term military power development, which is why other societies don't do this. Because like the core relationship here is that you have an underlying peasantry, small farmers working small farms, and then you have the aristocrats that often own a bunch of that land. And economically, what the aristocrats can do is crush down those small farmers, get them into tiny little plots, tax and rent the heck out of them, and keep them very poor. But then those people aren't going to fight
But that's
because
the historic norm.
yeah, that's what happens like everywhere. That's the standard. And it's striking that the Roman political economy does not proceed in this direction. That instead, and we'll come to Libertas later, but instead, like the Roman small farmer is able to sort of protect some of his wealth from the aristocrat, the big man on the hill. Um, and that the Republic is kind of designed to do that. I think there are a few things pushing at this. Some are pushing up from below, and some are sort of factors for the senatorial elite. The big factor for the senatorial elite um, is that military command is competitive. So it isn't the king is always the general of the army, so who cares? Right. The military command rotates on an annual basis. It's chosen by election. And so if you want your shot at military glory, you have to win elections and then you have a year. And then second, military glory is the only kind of glory that matters. And so there is real pressure on the Roman aristocracy, right? When the Senate sits down to make a decision, all of the high up senators that are really moving this debate, they are thinking about their plan to run for the consulship in 5 or 10 years when they'll be general of the army, and they will be the one wielding these military resources, hoping to win a big victory that gets them a triumph, because a triumph is the highest honor that you can win as a Roman man. And I will note the Romans don't give triumphs for anything other than military victory. You can't, if you cure cancer, you still don't get a triumph in the Roman Republic. You have to win a battle. You have to win big. And so there is a corporate pressure on the Roman aristocracy to maximize military power because everybody is thinking about when they're going to command the army, as opposed to either in a, say, a monarchic system where the king has an incentive to maximize military power, but his aristocrats have incentives to maximize their ability to extract from their peasants.
Right.
And like, what does it matter for you if the king's army is a little smaller? Like, boo-hoo. Um, or on the flip side, if you look at something like a Greek polis, where there are more dynamics of political influence and power, wealth maybe matters a little more, and military glory is not the sine qua non of a political career, you can see also the incentive to maybe crush down your peasants a little harder, get a little more money, use it to campaign or build a temple or something. And for the Romans, right, it is a one-stop shop. The question is leading armies. Um, and some of that is almost certainly coming out of pressure. Italy in the early Roman Republic is a rough neighborhood. It is exposed um, to external pressures in a way that Greece, which is I joke to my students, is a peninsula on a peninsula with its own peninsula, so it's quite sheltered, is not. Greece is the kiddie pool of the Mediterranean world. Italy is very much not. You have Gallic peoples coming down from the north. You have Greek settlers coming in from the east. You have Punic settlers coming in from the south. And then you have the already fragmented politics of Italy, whereas Greece is mostly one culture. Italy is a bunch of different cultures. Three major religious groups, a dozen different languages. Um, and so all of the states in Italy are under a lot of pressure to maximize military power and to sort of do what it takes to maximize military power. And so you see that reflected in the Roman elite. They're incentivized both internally and also by a feeling of external pressure. Internally, you want to maximize military power so that when it's your turn to lead the army, it's a good army. And externally, you want to maximize military power because state extinction is a real threat. Like the possibility that you just lose. Right? I mean, famously in the 390s, roving band of Gauls does in fact defeat a Roman army and then burn Rome. Like you can just lose.
Hmm.
Um, those pressures lead to this sort of maximizing military power, and internally, that produces some of Rome's democratic institutions, because you need to get these guys on board, and you need to protect them legally, protect their persons and their wealth so that they're capable of serving. And then externally, it also influences the way that Rome interacts as it conquers Italy. That a lot of these states would you conquer the next town over and you take all their weapons and you make them pay you a bunch of money. And the Romans are like, well, that doesn't maximize military power. How about we don't take their money? We do take some of their land and we loot some things when we win. We do this. But then we say you don't pay taxes, but you serve in our armies and we're going to protect you, but you have to fight when we call. And we're going to replicate that system over and over again outwards so that even the non-Romans in Italy are fully integrated into the Roman military system. But on the flip side, right, in order to make that work, the Romans aren't extracting from them,
The
which in
extraction,
turn means they
the
have the money
extraction
to
is
serve.
conscription,
Yeah.
essentially. Look, what we want from you, instead of like, we rule you now, we beat you in battle, give us money, it's we rule you now, we beat you in battle, now you're in our army. That's
Now
the
you're in our army. And even the level of we rule you now is pretty limited. Um, Rome is clearly in the driver's seat. These are not equal relationships. Rome will pretend they're equal relationships. The Romans call these guys allies. They never call them subjects. They're very careful to maintain the sort of, if you'll pardon me, kayfabe, that this is an alliance system rather than an empire. Um, but they also interfere very minimally with the internal affairs of these communities. Right? It's kind of understood. These are supposed to still be self-governing communities. And so long as the troops show up on time, Rome will let you handle your own affairs. And the troops basically always show up on time.
It's like they finally cracked the thing that the sort of ancient Greeks never could do, in that they'd always be like, Athens or Sparta or Thebes leading sort of an alliance of cities. And
Mhm.
they'd, I believe, I don't know, you'll know more than me, but correct me, they do it by like saying, okay, you've all got to contribute to the war chest, and then we'll use that to hire mercenaries and so on. And these sorts of leagues, they'd never last more than a decade or two. They'd always fall
Yeah,
apart.
they're unstable.
Whereas Rome clicks how to do it and make it endure and sort of stay together even when it gets hit.
Yeah, part of it is that the Greeks are assholes about it, which is just weird to say, but there it is. Um, I think it's Polly Lowe who talks about the Greek diplomatic quote language of Kratos, the language of power. But this is like Greek diplomatic communications in these leagues are really blunt. That like the leading state is just throwing its weight around and talking about its empire and talking about how you got to do what we say or we'll just crush you. Um, you get that, of course, really famously in Thucydides, things like the Melian dialogue, right? The Athenians are incredibly blunt in Thucydides. You also get it um, with just the Spartans all the time. Um, right. I'm always struck by everyone remembers that bit in 300, which it is drawn from Plutarch, where the Spartan king is, he's encountering an allied army and they're like, you brought so few people. And he does the like, what's your profession? What's your profession? What's your profession? And then he's like, Spartans, what is your profession? And they're all soldiers. And he's like, see, I brought more soldiers than you did. The thing is that that doesn't happen in the context of the Persian War. That happens in the context of the Theban War, a war Sparta will lose because it alienated all of its allies. And so it turns out that that, insulting all of your allies is a bad strategy.
I mean, is that
Um,
though a sort of like perhaps counter to how ancient societies are portrayed in movies and TV, and I think to some extent the popular imagination, where it's sort of a tough guy versus tough guy, and the toughest, most machismo guy wins, and there's certainly that element to it, but there's also a lesson here of like be realistic about power, but make it work for people and don't humiliate people if you can
right.
help it.
If you can help it. And this is kind of how the Romans think. And I don't want to overdo this. The Romans can be very brutal, but it's striking that when the Romans themselves talk about, what do they think they are best at? It is not a machismo thing. The words that come up are fides, faith and trust, keeping of bargains. It is um religio, which is religiously tinned, but also kind of a word keeping, bargain keeping, binding sort of word. Um, it is law, use. Like these are the words that come up when Virgil or Cicero are thinking about like what is it that is distinctively sort of Roman about culture. The Romans represent themselves diplomatically as the people of fides. They're like, we're the bargain keepers in this. If we make an agreement, we keep the agreement. And that's how they sort of present themselves, which is very different from that kind of macho image. Um,
There's also a kind of I call it realpolitik porn, and something like Game of Thrones would be a peak
yes,
example of this. In the Game of it's in general, I'd say modern fiction loosely drawing from ancient medieval worlds. Kind of like in Game of Thrones, everyone's always crossing each other and plotting, and it's sort of like almost no secret that
hmm,
everyone's playing some game. And of course, there's that in every society. But like in the ancient and medieval worlds, keeping your word was a really big deal. And
it was
like
really important.
being an oath breaker was like, it's not that there weren't oath breakers, but that was like the worst thing you could say about someone. It suggests that these were like very valued social norms.
Right. Yeah. Well, because so much in society depended on them. And one of the things that also conditions the way Roman aristocrats guide and shape their state, um, every ancient society has some kind of institution of patronage
Hmm.
where elites lord over but also kind of protect non-elites below them. But Roman patronage institutions are unusual in both they're very strong and pervasive and they're very open. So for instance, like the Greek world, there's all sorts of patronage, but it was seen as shameful. It was shameful to be a client. It's not shameful to be a client in Rome. Everybody's a client at some point in their life of somebody. Even the very wealthy, early in their political career, would be the clients of established politicians. Um, and so the system is very open and it conditions its rituals, and they are rituals, condition the way Roman elites govern. When a Roman elite is given a problem, the sort of script he has to fall back on is patron-client relationships. And these are relationships between free citizen individuals. They demand a degree of politeness. Just as the Romans never call their allies subjects, so too a Roman patron never calls his client a client in public. That would be an insult to honor that would endanger the relationship. You call your clients friends. You call other people's clients clients. But you always call your clients for my friend, right? And so you can imagine like the wealthy Roman aristocrat talking about like his friend, the poor tailor. Like these guys aren't friends. The tailor is his client, but he's going to maintain that fiction. And then in exchange, right, the client is expected to, the phrase here is actually to preserve the maestas, to preserve the majesty of his patron. Um, and maestas here, like literally the bigness, the greatness of his patron. Um, and so that relationship also conditions both the way that Roman aristocrats see their role within society, that it it is unequal, it is hierarchical, it is not domination in that same sense. It is a reciprocal relationship. You owe duties to your client, just as they owe duties to you. This is the Roman term here is the exchange of officia and beneficia. You have uh, the initiating partner does a beneficium, a favor that they were not obligated to do, which creates a tie of obligation, which then creates officia, obligated duties. Um, and as a Roman aristocrat, your political power, your standing in society is based on having a large number of clients. If you break your word to one of them, you endanger your relationship with all of them. So
Mm,
you can't do like you use the Game of Thrones example, like Tywin Lannister stuff. You'll destroy yourself.
mm,
Um, so yeah, keeping your word in public is really important. And the people that don't, our sources occasionally remark on them that like, oh, this guy when he was out in the province was really rapacious and he stole all the things. And then the Senate exiled him or censured him or took all his money because it was important that the state, that the republic keep its word as well. It's actually quite striking that the Romans are they they never Roman provincial government is by modern standards fantastically corrupt. All empires are like that. What's striking is that the Romans are unusual in that they really do try to tamp it down. That the Roman state is quite concerned that its governors overseas dealing with truly subject populations. And they're like, well, you shouldn't steal all their stuff. You
mm.
should only take the amount of their stuff that was the agreed upon amount when we made peace. And if you take too much, we have a special court in Rome, the Quaestio de Repetundai, um, literally the court for things you need to give back. What a wonderful name. Which will put you on trial for corruption and force you to return whatever property you took. And you do get provincial governors convicted in those courts.
Now, Cicero
Uh,
got his start, right? He prosecuted the
yes,
governor.
Varys. Yes, the governor of Sicily. Successfully. Yeah. He he wrecks Varys' career. Varys goes into exile rather than waiting for the judgment of the jury because he knows he's toast.
So, talk to me maybe a bit about, we've done a while on the sort of popular inputs, both politically and militarily, and how, what's the career path for an aristocrat then? Because this is, if I'm in my, you know, Battle of Hastings type time zone, it's like you extract rents from below you, and maybe you and your mates go and brutalize some people or beat up a bunch of fellow aristocrats. It's very, there's a different career path for Roman
Yeah.
aristocrats here.
Yeah.
I love that.
Um, so the key thing to note is that the Romans do not have separate military and civil career paths.
Right.
There is one career path. They have a name for it, the cursus honorum, the path of honors. And there is an expected sequence of offices you hold with customary ages for running for them. And they're mostly elected. So there are a so the first requirement in the Republic, you have to have been in the army for 10 years as a regular soldier of some sort before you're eligible for any office. So if you're a young Roman aristocrat from a very blue-blooded family, the kind of person who expects to go into the Senate at some point, you become eligible for military service at 17, and you're going to want to start doing that right away. Because 10 years means you're going to actually need to volunteer some. You're not going to get drafted 10 times. So you want to do this. The ideal way to do this is as a military tribune. Um, these are staff officers assigned to each legion that support the commanding general, who is going to be a consul or a praetor. We'll get to those in a second. Um, and so some of these are elected, some of these are appointed. So as a Roman elite, you might try to win that election to be a military tribune. That would be quite prestigious. Or get picked. You're quite a young man doing this, right? You're talking about someone who's you probably have a couple of years as a ranker before you're pulled in as a military tribune, but you're probably talking about someone who's 20, 21, 22, serving as these sort of staff officers.
Or are these the sort of like getting the general's coffee guys, as it were?
Yeah. So they have real authority though.
Hmm.
Right, a Roman army might have normally two legions in it. The consul can't be personally commanding both legions. And so the standard thing was there are six military tribunes assigned to each legion. They rotated who's actually in daily command, and they did it in pairs because they're young and stupid. Um, but they lead foraging parties, they handle some logistics, they can act in place of the general where he needs them to. And you have to imagine that the general is thinking in terms of like he knows these guys. So, the idiot cousin is probably not going to get given a battlefield command. Um, and some of the military tribunes, I should note, some of them are these young up and coming men. Some of them are much more experienced men who have gone much further in the career path, who are sort of looping back to because the general is their friend or what have you. So you've got a mix in the military tribunes of experienced men and kind of guys that are learning the ropes.
So it's almost
But
subconsciously like a training thing. We'll get a
it is
couple of
it's very consciously a training thing. Our sources are explicit about this.
okay.
Um,
And so you might pick a mix. Let's get a few people who've actually done it all before and will be useful, and a few people who are enthusiastic and they're learning the ropes and so on.
right. And
Okay.
especially, Roman generals are expected to hold councils of war for major decisions. And you imagine the junior military tribune, the 21-year-old aristocrat, is mostly a listener at this sort of council. Nobody cares about what his opinion is. But you might well imagine that like a military tribune there that's been praetor before and is doing this in between the praetorship and the consulship, like his opinion is going to get listened to. The Romans are very much a society where status matters, and like the Romans feel it. Men who have achieved things speak with weight, and you were expected to defer to them. And the Romans describe this as an almost physical experience of I need to shut up. That guy is talking. And he's more important than me. Um, but so you'd start out with the military tribunate. There are also a couple of, well, a bunch, 26, in fact, junior offices in Rome that you can hold to sort of burnish your careers. And then the first major office you run for is actually the quaestorship, which is a financial treasury office. There are 8 of these guys. Um, um, One assigned to each overseas praetor and consul, and then 2 in the city of Rome managing the main treasury. These guys keep the books. They're financial officials. You'd be quaestor in your 30s. So you've had your time to get your military experience in your late teens and 20s. Um, and this is mostly a non-military office. Quaestors don't do battlefield commands. They might end up in command if the general dies because they're the next most senior magistrate with an army. Um, but for the most part, it's a sort of financial civil job. Um, After that, you have a few years break. During that, you might run to be either Edile. There are 4 of these guys. They supervise roads, public works, festivals, and temples. The big thing, if you're really rich, the Edileship is a good office to have because while you do get some state money, you're expected to chip in some of your own. If you're really rich, you can chip in a whole lot of money and be like, look at all the temples I refurbished. And that burnishes your political reputation going forward. Um, there's also the 10 tribunes of the plebs. It's after the quaestorship that you'd normally take a shot at those.
So I've
Um,
never understood Tribune of the Plebs. Do you want to spend maybe a couple of paragraphs on that? Like, I don't wrap my head around this office at all. Perhaps because it doesn't have a modern analog, but then none of this really has a mod. Anyway,
None of this really has a modern analog.
tell me
So,
about Tribune of the Plebs.
tribunes of the plebs. So the tribune of the plebs, this is an office. Part of the reason it's so weird is that it is the most ad hoc of these offices. It is created explicitly out of the struggle of the orders and is created at an early point where all of the offices otherwise are restricted to patricians. And so the plebeians are like, well, then we want our own magistrates. And these positions, the tribunes of the plebs basically begin as like the protest organizers, the unofficial leaders of the plebeians in their political agitation. And then one of the early compromises they get is to get these guys recognized as major officials, as real officials in the state. Um, the core powers that they have all come from the fact that all plebeians swear to defend the tribunes and to violently murder anyone who assaults a tribune. And it's a religious oath. And this creates a quality around the tribunes, which gets called sacrosanctitas. They're sacrosanct. You cannot touch or obstruct them. Um, and then they can use that power in all sorts of exciting ways. Roman politics is entirely in person. It is heavily religiously tinged. And so let's say the tribune thinks the Senate is going to do something bad. Well, just stand in the doorway and don't let any senators enter the building. Senate can't meet, so nothing happens.
But so
Um,
the functional output of that is any single one of them, and there's sorry, 12?
10.
10, okay. But still, there's 10 of them. Any single one of them is an incredible veto point in the system.
Yes.
Oh, like,
And it's offset by the fact that they are all relatively junior individuals who are hoping to move forward in politics.
but
So
that's the
each,
constraint on like I can veto anything for any reason is okay, but you still want to get elected to the next thing, right? That's the functional constraint.
right.
But
And
people will start to realize, okay, but I still have this veto power I can play with.
right. And eventually we'll see beginning with Tiberius Gracchus in 133, a sort of recognition of, oh, you could use the tribune's powers much more aggressively than is traditional.
But
But for the first
presumably, it went,
400 years,
yeah, it went on a long while before anyone thought to do, or it just it was customary that they had this protection, but not that they used it in that way.
right. And particularly for things like veto powers, the Romans understood veto powers. The consuls also have the power of veto, um, as a delay rather than a stop. Um, like I'm struck, for instance, like in the U.S. Senate, with a bill gets filibustered, and people
I
are
was
like, the bill
just
is
thinking
dead.
filibuster as an analog.
Yeah,
But to your analogy, and probably where you were going to go with that, the filibuster power being used in that way is a comparatively modern innovation.
right, right.
That is not how it's been understood historically. It was used selectively. It was
Mhm.
used to delay. When Medicare was first passed, it was passed with 54 votes, and that was a huge, big, controversial thing. And
Right.
nobody thought to filibuster it.
Nobody thought to filibuster it.
Even though in theory there were, what, 46 votes on the other side, anyone could have got up and read the
Right.
thesaurus or something, but they didn't. It wasn't the done
They
thing.
didn't. Yeah,
Whereas now it's just part of the functioning of our system that for most normal votes you're expected to break a filibuster.
right.
But that didn't
And
pass. Anyway,
yeah, no, I mean, very much so. And so, and of course, if the tribune vetoes like a law, all that does is it resets the timer, right? You just post the same text of the law the next day, and you have to wait a couple of weeks, and then you try the vote again. Importantly, all of these powers must be exercised in person. So if a tribune really wants to keep like you from doing anything, they do need to follow you around all day, every day. They can't just sit in their house and be like, I say he doesn't do anything. Like they need to be there in person to do it. Which also discourages that kind of sort of gamesmanship. Um, and the Senate, we'll get to, like, the Senate is part of the mediating institution here, because the other thing that you could do if you're getting blocked by a tribune, is you could go to the Senate and you could say, what is the collective Senate's opinion? And if the Senate's opinion is that the tribune should let this go to a vote, as the tribune, you would have to be a very great idiot to continue blocking it if you intend to have a political career, right? Because the 300 most influential men in Rome have all collectively told you to shut up and sit down.
but we've still got one final one to go, the consulship, right? Or is there what?
Praetors and consuls,
Oh, do praetors I always forget about. What are praetors?
little consuls.
Okay.
Um, so praetors and consuls both have the power of imperium, which is how the Romans understood royal power. Imperium is the power to wield violence for the community. Internally, that means it's the power to organize courts. And so all of the courts in Rome are overseen by two of the six praetors. But consuls can set up a court too. They can deliver judgment. Eventually, these are all jury courts, but the praetors still oversee it. It's their legal power to organize courts. And then outside of the city of Rome, Imperium is the power to command armies, to wield violence on behalf of the community externally.
So we would totally see that as two separate concepts, but to them it's
Yes. It's actually very significant. The Romans see these two as fundamentally linked. Imperium can't be divided in any way. You either have none of it or all of it. So these are the two offices with Imperium, the consuls and the praetors. The consul's Imperium is superior. They can give the praetors orders, though they don't usually. Um, what really differentiates the two offices is the assignments they tend to get. And this is a wholly customary part of Rome's system, which is just you hold elections every year. All of these offices are 1 year long. So you elect six new praetors and two new consuls, and then by custom, the Senate meets and gives a set of instructions to each of these new magistrates. And by custom, two of the praetors are always assigned to be in the city of Rome running the court system. The remaining four handle the two provinces in Spain, the province of Sicily, and the province of Corsica and Sardinia. It's one province. Those are the four overseas praetors. In an emergency, they can also be given army commands or tasked somewhere else, but that's where they normally go. And then the two consuls command Rome's primary field armies in whatever the most important conflict of the day is. And there's always an important conflict. The Roman Republic lasts almost 500 years. It is at peace for 8 of them. So there's always a war on. That's what the consuls do. It's also expected that the consuls move major legislation. So the consuls would be the proposers of major legislation, though other
How does that
officials
work
can legislate.
if they're on campaign the entire year?
So they do it right at the beginning of the year, or right at the end during the winter.
Okay, so this campaign season, legislative season, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. And
So,
eventually the Romans will actually crank the calendar slightly to make this easier. So the Roman year originally began in March,
hmm,
which is when the campaigning season begins. As Roman campaigning gets further and further afield, they crank the start of the year and therefore the start of the consul's term back to January 1st, which is why it is where it is now. It's why if people have ever wondered why September, October, November, and December are all month names that are clearly numbers, but they're all off by two.
hmm.
Um, it's not because the Romans added months. They didn't. That's the myth is that this is Julius Caesar's fault. It's not. It's because in the second century, the Romans cranked the beginning of the year back
Yeah.
into January, whereas originally January and February would have been the last 2 months.
I did not know that. There you go. Uh,
Yep,
so with the consuls, if I'm thinking about this as like a sort of modern equivalent to a president or something, I'm just getting that wrong. This isn't like the head of, these are like your two top generals, essentially. This is like you're going to have a draft each year, and these are the people who get first dibs on assignments. That's
pretty
like,
much.
well,
Yeah.
more than like you're the embodiment of the Roman state or something.
Right. And this is an important thing to remember. The Romans don't have something like a cabinet. Um, each of these officials that we've listed off, the quaestors, the tribunes, the praetors, the aediles, and so on, they are all independently elected. They're none of them are appointed. They each have their own election. And so the quaestor's authority over financial matters is wholly independent of the consul's authority over the army. Those are two different elected officials that have different sources of legitimacy. So when the consul goes out into the field, one of the quaestors will be assigned to be with him to make sure the army gets paid. Very important. And while like the consul is clearly in charge and the quaestor is there to support him, the quaestor is not dependent upon the consul for his office. He was independently elected. And indeed, the expectation is at the end of the campaign, both the consul and the quaestor will submit separate copies of their account books so that the Senate can compare. And so if you've been stealing the money, your quaestor can rat you out, and may very well do so. Now, of course, the quaestor is younger. He's a more junior official. And so that Roman social status is gonna make him defer to the consul in most cases because the consul's been through all of this and the quaestor hasn't. But it is really striking that like the Romans do not have a unitary executive, if you want to think about that. They don't even have a two-part executive. They have a 20-part executive. All of these functions split between magistrates who are free actors within the zone of their authority.
It's you're filling a job and a fairly short run contract job.
Yeah.
at that. But in the same way as we talked about how like the whole social structure, the whole way elites manage their farmers, the whole alliance system is geared towards how many heavy infantry could we put in the field? The career path is geared towards how do we have someone who can march 20,000 men from point A to point B without starving or getting lost? Like
Yeah.
that's the idea, right? It's like you've got like a 15-year, 20-year apprenticeship, and then you'll have to get multiple rounds of buy-in of the people who of no, maybe not the people you'll be leading, but of the social orders who will constitute the army you'll be leading, weighted
Right.
by how useful they are to that army. And
Yes.
then the idea is at the end point you have like a quasi meritocratic career path that will produce someone who is up to the job of taking 20,000 men around.
Right. And it's important to note, if people haven't been tracking the numbers, this is an elimination contest,
Yeah.
right? There are eight quaestors, but six praetors and two consuls. And in any given year, there are 70 odd military tribunes, because Rome has a lot of legions in the field at any given time. So at every stage, right, ideally, the fail sons of the aristocracy are being filtered out by the voters. Um, who are like, well, this guy was a crappy quaestor, so he doesn't go forward. This guy's year as praetor was a mess, so he doesn't go forward. And so like each sort of single year age cohort, starts with probably a few dozen hopeful Romans, two of which will make to the consulship. Um, and so, yeah, there is a sort of a quasi meritocratic kind of system, and it is a long apprenticeship. So that by the time you're consul, you've done all of these other jobs, many of which have involved you observing previous consuls and how they do the job. Um, and then the mediating institution that gets all of these guys moving in the same direction as the Senate.
So what is the Senate? Because that,
So, yeah, the Senate is a debating council, roughly 300 men. It consists of everyone who's held an office, the quaestorship or higher. Um,
so these guys
which
are not submitting themselves to regular elections. They don't
no,
serve terms of office,
no.
anything like that.
Once you're in the Senate, you remain in the Senate for life. There are two officials, the censors, who, if they agree, can remove a senator for gross moral turpitude. This is very rare. It has to be pretty bad. Um, Instead, right, so the Senate is not a representative body. It is not understood like a legislature in that sense. Instead, the Senate is a well of experience and authority. Here are the 300 at any given time, the 300 most experienced, important statesmen in the Republic. Um, and the wild thing about the Senate is that it has no formal powers whatsoever.
Right.
The Senate can't legislate, it can't elect anybody, it can't do anything, it doesn't do trials, nothing. The Senate merely advises the magistrates. But because it is a body of the 300 most politically important people, you would be an idiot as a magistrate to ignore it. Um, because, right, if the next time you go for election, 280 of the most influential politicians all collectively come out and say, this guy was a doofus, you shouldn't vote for him, you're not getting voted for. Again, remember, Rome is a society where there is an expected degree of deference to authority. And so the word of those senior senators carries weight with the voters. Not only do they kind of wield their clients, but they wield influence in society. And so the collective influence of the Senate is overpowering. Um, it's very rare to see a Roman politician whose sort of personal brand is strong enough to swim even a little bit upstream against the Senate. It happens, men like Scipio Aemilianus. Uh, but he destroyed Carthage. Like that's what it takes. Um, and even then, he doesn't swim upstream against the Senate a lot. Um, and so the Senate advises. Its primary role is debate. The assemblies, I noted, don't debate. The Senate does. Um, so what will happen is a magistrate will seek the advice of the Senate, and you technically don't have to, but this is an expected customary thing. And if you don't, it's a major breach. Um, And if you haven't sought the advice of the Senate, then you're probably not going to get the assembly to vote for whatever proposal you're proposing anyway, because the voters will assume that it's bad because you didn't seek the advice of the 300 guys who know what's going on. You seek the advice of the Senate, you put a proposal to them, the Senate debates freely. Um, the debate proceeds in rank order. So you start with the oldest former consul and then work your way down through all of the consuls by seniority of office. And then you go to the oldest former praetor and you work your way down until you finally get to the newest, greenest quaestor at the bottom. Naturally speaking, earlier is going to give you more influence on the course of the debate. So the debate is really guided by the senior consuls. And we're told that like the junior members of the Senate, they are generally just going to stand up and for their speech, they're going to be like, I agree with so and so, and then they're going to sit down. It's quite rare for like a junior senator to give a major speech. And the other thing we're told is that the more junior senators would, in the early course of the debate, when the consulars are speaking, consular being the word for anyone who's held the consulship, when the consulars are speaking, the junior senators would move around the room. So you'd go to sit near the person you agree with. So it's like somebody makes a good point, you're like, yeah, he is right. You'd get up and you'd walk over and you sit down next to him. And so you could watch the debate physically move around the room and get a sense of which side, where the bulk of the opinion of the Senate was. When the debate was done, a vote could be called. The presiding magistrate had to do this. Um, and the result of the vote was published as the Senatus Consultum, the opinion of the Senate, which was wholly and completely non-binding, but like you're never going to get a popular assembly to vote for something that the Senate thinks is a bad idea.
So it's in many ways, to move us on to sort of a theory question to close with, you get a narrative emerging from this to some degree with Machiavelli, particularly with Montesquieu, and then that becomes influential with the American founding of different types of power divided by types of power. That doesn't seem to be the case at all in the Roman system. Power is distributed, but you don't have divisions between like executive and legislative.
Right.
Not really, but
Not
it's
really.
distributed a lot across a lot of different people. But you also have this idea of like an animosity of different types of power, that people will butt heads and block each other. Like
Hmm.
power attracts power. That's the underlying logic of the American system. It seems like in the Roman system, the ideal is more cooperative, that the population and the Senate will sort of listen to and be guided by each other to an extent.
This is certainly the ideal.
I mean, I'm not
Um,
saying that always happens, but that's like the theory, I guess, of
and
it.
there's a sense, for instance, like one of the interesting things. So one of the debates that's been going for quite some time about how democratic is the republic centers around these assemblies. And we talked about the biggest one. There are others. The other assemblies are actually somewhat more one man, one vote democratic. Um, but one of the things is that just we know where these assemblies met, and voter participation had to be extremely low for them to meet in those physical spaces. Most people didn't attend. Um,
Just because you couldn't have fit that many
you
people in.
couldn't have fit that many people. Um, and You know, you imagine probably a lot of people showed up for really big important votes, but for most stuff, voter attendance is probably pretty low. Um, but but there was a sense that we see like pervading our sources in discussing the policies of the Republic that like the Senate will initially be sour on an idea. Someone's proposing something and the Senate doesn't really like, but it's popular. It's got a lot of popular support. And there's a sense that as that popular support is manifested, it's manifested by large gatherings, by sometimes literally protests. There's a feeling that the blocking agents have to get out of the way. Um, they can delay it, but they can't stop it. It would be ungentlemanly to just block it. Which I think is really striking. It speaks to that kind of cooperative nature that, like, yes, the Senate is supposed to be, it's a separate body from the people. It does not channel their will. But if the people really, really, really want something, the Senate will usually eventually get out of their way. And that's just, again, that's kind of part of this sort of traditional sense. And I should note, like these traditional customs begin to break down in the late second century. In 133, you have Tiberius Gracchus. In 123, Gaius Gracchus, his brother, who are tribunes who exceed the normal limits of what the tribunate's supposed to do. In the first century, you increasingly see reactionary elements in the Senate refusing to get out of the way. Like this is Cato the Younger. I'm just not going to get out of the way of what the people really, really, really want to do. Um, and then you also see a breakdown in the sort of power sharing where you have your year as consul and then you're done for a while. You can run for the consulship like a second time, but customarily you're supposed to wait like a decade, and you're 40 by the time you hold the consulship, so you're just not going to do it that many times. And other people want it anyway. And you start to get commanders holding more frequent commands. And so the system breaks down as the norms that govern it collapse. What I think is striking is students often jump to the idea of, oh, well, these idiots should have written down the rules. And I'm like, so here's the funny thing is that after the first Roman bout of civil war, Sulla, who wins, does exactly that. He writes down all the rules. He codifies them all. And he thinks like, I fixed the problem. And his new legally codified republic breaks down way faster than the Republic of Norms, like almost immediately begins coming apart. Because it turns out that when the norms have collapsed, writing the rules down doesn't mean anything.
I think this is distinctively American in some ways. Like, obviously, the British don't think about things.
Right, you have an unwritten constitution, so like,
Yeah, yeah. But like if you think about like, I would say it's always a tension though between like so there is some random 1970s Justice Department memo that says you can't arrest a sitting president. Now,
right.
that is not in the Constitution. It's not anything, it's not even ordinary law.
Mhm.
And yet, very, very, very consequential decisions have been made by courts, by the Justice Department, by Congress, because that's the thing. That's like everyone's looking for, like, can we do this? And you've got a memo, and that's
You've got
it.
a memo, and that's the norm.
And that's become, I would say, a de facto constitutional document, but it's not been
Mhm.
ratified. It's not even ordinary law. And, or if you look at like well, to take your case, and I know you've talked about this a lot, what counts as a war? What permissions do you need
Right.
to engage in a war? You have a set of norms governing that, which are now even the norms are collapsing. But I think we can sometimes think either it's codified or it's not. And it's always kind of just like shifting around somewhere between the two. And sometimes it means something when it's codified, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. And then the norm really only exists if you're willing to enforce it,
Yeah.
right? Like the constitutional notion that the president can't declare war will only become real when a president is sent to prison for doing so.
Yeah.
Like that's it. Like you have to do that or it doesn't matter. The war powers resolution and everything else, it doesn't matter until you drop the hammer on someone for breaking the norm.
Or to follow your point about like if the entire Senate says you're being a dumbass, that carries weight.
Mm,
Like, I think about in the American case, I think there was an assumption amongst a lot of people that when, starting the clock, as 10 years ago, people started doing a lot of stuff that was maybe not technically illegal, but not the done way of doing things. And in many
mm,
things, straightforwardly was illegal. The voters would move against that. Parties
right.
would abandon it. People would just kind of walk sideways on it and you wouldn't get elected again in future. And now that there's not that sort of informal set of consequences, people are just like, so I guess we can do it then.
Right. And of course, and this is the thing, of course, at any point, the system can impose consequences and then suddenly the norms are real again.
Yeah.
Um, And yeah, and this is something that we see in the breakdown of the late Republic, even beginning really early. Like I mentioned, Scipio Aemilianus. He's elected consul twice and technically illegally both times, but he's super successful, so nobody enforces the norms on him. And that is going to become the predicate for Gaius Marius's repeated illegal consulships, where he's consul like 5 years running. Um, seven consulships total, but there's a break. There's a couple years between his first and then his solid run and then his last. Um, and um, right, and in the end, right, the system was unwilling or unable to enforce consequences on, in this case, successful generals who violated the norms. And then we see in the first century where that leads is the sort of rogue generals like Caesar and Pompey ripping the Republic apart. Um, and this is the kind of, we talked about the kind of in a way, the weird way that the kind of the Roman love of military glory shaped the republic to almost be more inclusive and democratically. This is the dark side of that. That
Hmm.
because military glory is the only kind of glory that matters, if you win your battles, it becomes very hard to enforce consequences on you in this political system. Um, and so eventually you get generals like Sulla and Caesar and Pompey who realize that as long as they keep winning, the laws are basically meaningless.
Yeah.
And this leads to the collapse of the system into civil war.
That seems to me to be the analog much more than the division of powers story. I'm not wholly convinced the division of power. The division of powers is a nice theory. I'm not sure to what extent that functionally describes any actual system. I think it's like whatever set of rules you have, be they formal or informal, there does need to be consequences for breaking them. That's
Hmm.
kind of like the model that's the historical modern parallel I would draw. But to your point, you can always turn them back on again. And it's like, I think this will be a very, very interesting question for, let us just say, Democrats return to power in, what would it be, 28? Do you use that power to do, oh, we're going to do some new healthcare, some new big progressive thing? Or is your main political push, we're going to punish wrongdoing? Because I think you made this point on Blue Sky. We are very, very geared to not put generals on trial in this
Right.
country or not put police on. That is going to be a hell of a heavy lift
Yep.
politically. Or to
Yep.
even put ex-presidents on trial. I think Trump
Right.
even being like, no, you can't forge checks was a shock to a lot of people.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it will be an interesting case for us of like, I think that the overwhelming urge will be, look, let's just do something that'll make the voters happy and be popular. And like Biden did, let's pass some big
Yeah.
progressive thing. Or like Obama did, let's pass
Hmm.
some big progressive thing. And I think it will be a difficult case to make of like, actually, we need to do the consequence thing.
Yep.
But
On the flip side, you can also just see so much pressure building towards that goal, right? I sometimes like I look and I talk about the fight, no fight axis in American
yeah,
politics. And when you look at what's happening in Democratic primaries, man, fight keeps winning. And
every
so there's every time. And so it's going to be hard. There's going to be this, on the one hand, as you say, the kind of desire to just do popular things. And on the other hand, this pressure to fight. And it may just come down literally to personalities. One thing that you come away with very clearly studying the Roman Republic is that personalities matter.
yeah.
It's really striking that the Roman Republic in the 400s, in the 300s, in the early 200s was able to compromise its way through these really major divisions and struggles in defining what the state would be, what the consequences would be, what the rules would be. And the aristocracy is flexible. They are able to compromise and they are able to manage it. And then you look at the crisis from 133 to 49. And in refusing to compromise anything, the Roman aristocracy loses everything.
Hmm.
And its personalities. It's, the men did not meet the moment. Um, Caesar and Cato the Younger are the wrong men for their moment. Um, and there you go. Even Cicero, I think. Poor Cicero, he tries so hard, but when you read Cicero, you realize he's not really capable of thinking institutionally. He can only think in terms of sort of virtue ethics.
Hmm.
And it's like Cicero, man, you need to think a little more about maybe elements of the system that aren't working, and he can't. The only guy that thinks institutionally is Octavian.
Who's the one who finally wraps the whole thing up, or at least navigates it into something else? Oh,
Oh,
we're,
but Octavian told me he saved the Republic. He
Right.
was very effusive on this point.
Anyway, I could go on about the modern parallels. I think that's another one. We have a generation of politicians who do not think institutionally. Like it's
No,
just, I think if you ask democratic like lawmakers, like why do good or bad, why do we still have the filibuster? They're kind of like, well, because it is. They
because
don't,
it is.
you know, and I think that's going to have to be. I mean, I think there will be a certain amount of churn because people want to fight and they don't feel like people are fighting.
Yeah,
But we shall see.
we
Anyway,
shall see.
that was a real pleasure, Brett. Thank you so much for coming on. As always, if you want to support this podcast, please do sponsor me on Patreon. I don't run any ads, I don't do any commercial sponsors. So everything's made possible with the voluntary support of listeners. Brett has a fantastic blog called, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, where should listeners go to follow you, Brett?
Uh, so I write at a collection of unmitigated pedantry that is acoup.blog, where I write about a mix of military history, ancient history, some popular culture, mostly history stuff. You can also find me on Blue Sky under my own real name, so I'm not hard to find. Um, thanks for having me on. This was fantastic.
Yep, thank you so much.